Well, how I got involved, Randolph from Inglewood Neighborhood Center, which is the neighborhood center that I grew up in. I just love the idea because growing up at the shop that I grew up in, they gave me an opportunity, so why not give back?
I always love art, like in any type of form. If it's drawing, tattoo, graffiti, haircuts, anything. So once I turned 16, I got involved with the program. Since then, I've been working here at the barbershop and learning new things.
He comes in, he helps out with a lot of just, the basics, from sweeping hair to standing behind somebody's chair asking questions. And I think him seeing my actions and the way I move and how everything functions, I think he picks up on a lot of that as well. But
the thing that I learned so far is the more customers you can gain in the barber industry it's not just by cutting hair and like cutting good. That's not what barbering is all about. It's also having a connection with your clients and understanding them. And they were just teaching us how to manage our money, save it, and just use it properly in the proper way.
From business owner to business owner, if we can help and the more people get involved, the better the chances are that these young men growing up and young women growing up, they can change their life.
I want to be a barber, and I also want to have my own business in the barber industry as well.
Good morning and welcome to the April 24th, 2023 workshop of the Orlando City Council. Good morning, Commissioners. You know that as a city and a council, we've been committed to making sure that every person, regardless of economic status, has access to quality housing that they can afford. And we continue to implement short and long-term strategies to expand our housing inventory. The legislature recently passed a piece of legislation known as the Live Local Act, which was recently signed by the governor. It will take effect on July 1st. I've asked Elizabeth to give us a overview of how that may enhance our opportunity to create housing opportunities. Elizabeth Dang, our City Planning Division Manager.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Elizabeth Dang. I'm the City Planning Division Manager, here today to talk about the Live Local Act. So this was indeed signed by the governor on March 29th with tremendous support from the legislature. It becomes effective on July 1st. But the legislative session is not over. Kyle Shepard is our representative up in Tallahassee today. So he was not able to join us, but he's keeping an eye on potential changes to this legislation through other bills. So there's still a possibility this is not the last word on these changes. The goal of this act is to increase the supply of affordable housing by addressing funding, tax incentives, local preemption of zoning regulations, and other updates. And I want to mention too that this presentation was put together with assistance from our team in Housing and Community Development, Orrin Henry and Sonia and Jessica. And the point being here that some of this will be implemented by the Economic Development Department and some will be implemented by Housing and Community Development. So that team is also here today if you have any questions. First up, let's define affordable housing. Basically, housing can cost any amount as long as it's affordable to the people who live in that home. And that's defined as 30% of that household's monthly income or less. And some people pay quite a bit more than that, and we consider those cost-burdened households. But the state defines affordability in comparison to the area median income. So as of this year, that's about $80,000 in Orange County. And the various housing programs define affordability as a range of income from 30% to 120% of that $80,000 AMI. And again, those programs limit the rent and utility cost to 30% of the income for that household. So I think that we have an expectation that affordable housing really targets these very low income households, and many programs do. People earning minimum wage, $23,000 a year, that type of thing. That type of housing does require pretty substantial subsidies to cover the difference between the rent someone can afford and what market rent is. Whereas those moderate income families, they may be much closer to being able to find a market rate unit without any assistance. So today's average market rent in Orlando is about $1,900 a month. So a family of four at 60% of the area median income earns about $50,000, and they could afford a 3-bedroom apartment at about $1,300 a month. That's a lot less than that average rent in Orlando, so they may have trouble finding a market rate unit that they can afford, or they might wind up paying much more than 30% of their income. At 120% AMI, a 2-person household earns about $80,000 and could afford a 1-bedroom apartment at about $1,800 a month. So they're much more likely to be able to find a market rate unit, even though it's a little on the lower end of the scale. So the need for those subsidies grows with larger households as well as lower income households. So this act mentions several state programs repeatedly, and I wanted to make sure we're all familiar with these. The first one is called Hometown Heroes. This is a down payment assistance program, and up until this act was passed, the borrower was required to work in certain income eligible occupations. And the change here is it opens it up to all employed people in Florida within the required income limit, depending on the loan type and the household size. The second program is called the State Apartment Incentive Loan, which we call SAIL, and that provides low-interest loans to affordable housing developers based on certain criteria and providing certain amount of affordability through the units. The third program is called SHIP, which is the State Housing Initiatives Partnership. This is the funding that's distributed directly to local governments for new construction, rehabilitation, down payment assistance, and other housing programs targeted to certain income ranges, as well as a certain percent targeted to support homeownership. So the funding changes for this year are $252 million in funding for SHIP. According to the formula, Orlando will be given about $3.6 million for this upcoming fiscal year. Previous allocations have been kind of all over the place. We got a good allocation for this year of about $3 million, but it was zero as recently as 2020. So this one, having more certainty in the funding, will certainly help our housing team with their programs. The state has allocated another $100 million for down payment assistance for Hometown Heroes, $100 million for a new type of loan product for projects that have already been awarded financing but have found that their costs have gone up so quickly that they can't cover the cost to build the units that they committed to. So this will cover some of that gap for those projects. There's an additional $150 million for sale over 10 years each year, and another $109 million just for this year for the sale program. This act also provides new tax incentives for corporate taxpayers. They're eligible to direct certain tax payments directly to sale and other housing programs with a cap of $100 million each year. There's an existing program called Community Contribution Tax Credit, and that cap is being lifted from $14.5 million to $25 million. And finally, for developers who are funding projects through the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, they are eligible to request a sales tax refund of up to $5,000 on building materials. The Act also provides for a number of tax exemptions for affordable housing. First up, the State Housing Finance Corporation will offer a tax exemption for properties owned by a nonprofit and leased for at least 99 years for affordable housing. And that's typically community land trusts that are set up that way. The second type of tax exemption offered by the state is for moderate income affordable properties with at least 70 units set aside for households earning 120% of area median income or less. And again, that's also through the state. The third is an optional program that each local government can decide if it wants to authorize, but it can provide a local property tax exemption for affordable properties with at least 50 units and setting aside 20% of the units for households at 60% of AMI or less. And that's a shorter time frame to start, but it is renewable. And so for each of these types of tax exemptions, the property owner must apply to the appropriate agency. There's a partial or full exemption depending on the criteria in the statute, and it applies just for the time frame that the income and rent restrictions are in place. And we will be doing some research here in Orlando to see what properties may qualify for that local exemption, to see if that's something the city wants to pursue. So the big topic, and the one that we've gotten a lot of calls about already, are the zoning exemptions. So this applies to affordable projects which are defined in the statute as meaning that at least 40% of the units must be affordable, and they must be affordable at 120% area median income or less. And that affordability period needs to last at least 30 years. So for projects that meet those criteria, and are located in a commercial, industrial, or mixed-use zoning district, the local government must review the application administratively. There's no public hearing required, no comprehensive plan amendment required, no rezoning, no conditional use, just review of the site plan by the staff. So the maximum density allowed is up to the maximum in the jurisdiction, and there's a height limit that has to be at least 3 stories, or if the local government allows higher buildings, the highest allowed height within 1 mile of the project. A local jurisdiction also must consider reducing parking requirements for projects near a transit stop. But other than these height and density allowances, all other multifamily development requirements must be met. And these zoning exemptions last for 10 years and will expire in 2033. So locally in Orlando, our maximum density is 200 units per acre in downtown, which allows for high-rise multifamily development. So that would apply citywide for these affordable projects. The height limit that we have in commercial and mixed-use areas range from 35 feet to 400 feet or more. But based on our kind of first look, most eligible parcels will be within 1 mile of a zoning district that allows a 75-foot height limit or possibly more. And to note here that any parcel that's within 1 mile of downtown will not functionally have a zoning height limit, but will still need to meet the limit based on proximity to airport flight paths. So that's in our current code, and there wouldn't be an exemption to the aircraft requirements. So our staff has taken a look at which sites may be eligible, and this is kind of our initial draft. Each site would need to be reviewed at the time of application. So the areas shown colored in the map have commercial designations in green and industrial designations in orange. So those commercial areas already allow residential because Orlando has the mixed-use zoning categories. With a couple of exceptions, the industrial areas do not. So that's the areas that the city has not necessarily planned for all the services that go with residential because we were not expecting residential in those locations. So we'll have to evaluate for things like proximity to parks and schools as these projects come through. In addition to the zoning requirements, there are a few other development standards in the Act. First up, local governments are required to maintain a public written policy outlining procedures for expediting building permits and development orders for affordable housing projects. And this is very similar to some existing requirements that our housing and community development staff already do. So we'll take a look at this and see if any updates are needed. The second one is a couple years ago, the statutes were amended to allow local governments to approve projects with at least 10% affordable units in commercial, industrial, and residential zoning districts without any changes to the comp plan or zoning. This legislation takes out the ability to do so in residential zoning districts, and because it adds the ability basically automatically to do it with 40% affordability, I don't think that there will be a lot of demand for this type of review, but we'll see if that turns out to be different. And finally, the next change is prohibiting local governments from adopting rent control. The Act also provides for new requirements for publicly owned land inventory. And the state will be going through this exercise with state-owned lands, and each local government must publish a list at least every 3 years of land available and appropriate for use as affordable housing. The state will also offer some training and technical assistance regarding executing contracts for selling or leasing that property. So next steps for us is to evaluate how the zoning portions of the legislature apply in a little bit more detail. We'll look at some sites that are zoned for planned development, look more deeply at the height limit requirements. We'll also do some research to see if any code amendments are needed. One of the kind of unforeseen consequences is that affordable housing in a residential zoning district still has to go through the public hearing process. So they're at actually a disadvantage compared to a commercial zoning district and could take longer for review. So we will want to look into that. The second one is looking more carefully at multifamily setbacks and buffers adjacent to single family, because we will have some locations where it may not have been allowed before, particularly at the heights that are proposed. We'll also evaluate reductions in parking near transit. Our code is already pretty generous in this regard, but we'll take another look at that. And in terms of implementation, we'll be looking into how to monitor these affordable units over time. A lot of local governments use something called a land use restriction agreement to provide for that monitoring. And from there, we'll see how popular this legislation turns out to be. I think it's a real slam dunk for the traditional tax credit funded affordable projects. They'll be able to move more quickly. What we don't know yet is if this will be sufficient incentive to entice market rate developers to build affordable units as well. And I'm available if you have any questions.
Questions or comments for Elizabeth? Commissioner Sheehan?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. My concern is that when you're talking about 120 AMI or less, that's $69,000 per individual, or $80,000 per two-person household. I'm just concerned that this really isn't affordable housing. This is, you know, I think that the AMI is too high, and I know that state has put this on us, but 70,000 people making $70,000 a year aren't the ones that need housing. That's the issue. So my concern is that there's going to be a whole lot of people wanting to build for the $70,000 individuals, but they're not going to be building for the $30,000 and less individuals. So, you know, I think it's important we talk about AMI, that we put the income levels next to that, so people actually know what we're talking about. Because I had to look it up, and I'm worried that this is a wolf in sheep's clothing, that this is taking money that should be for affordable housing and using it not for affordable housing, but for people making almost $70,000 a year. So that's the concern that I've got with this, and I think we need to be transparent when we talk about it, and that we need to be encouraging more and more. I know Orrin and I talked about this, but you know, that percentage needs to be lower so that we make sure we're hitting the low-income people, not just that we're giving developers an incentive to build more housing that really doesn't benefit the people that are most in need. And I'm glad to see that we have, that we're going to be looking at the transition between residential and commercial, but there are areas where we have commercial zoning right up to residential, and you know, you might have a little single-family house next to a 7-story building, and that might not work for that little single-family house. So those are some of the concerns that I've got. But I think we need to, like I say, I'd like to see us, when we're talking about this, to talk about the income levels so that it's transparent to people that we need to do more for actual affordable housing and not divert state dollars into just building more housing that doesn't address the real affordability crisis. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hill and Commissioner Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. I echo my concerns with the affordability component also. I know that's more so of a HUD issue. Maybe we can work with our congressman and mayor to figure out those equations. I guess when I look at the map, I think, of course, District 5 is going to be more impacted than any. It seems bittersweet. We know we need a multitude. We can't build enough affordable housing before there's a waiting list. But also with the industrial, residential, commercial component, that's what we have there on the West Lakes and Paramore area. And my concern is gentrification. if we don't do it right. And the city, being one of the largest landowners, which I always thought was great, that we have a sufficient amount of land, Mayor, to revitalize Paramore responsibly, as you and council have done. I guess one of my thoughts was, where are we at with the vision plan of Paramore, Elizabeth, so that we can know how we're going to continue to build there in a economic and housing component as of yet?
Right. So I know we had discussed internally and with you about looking at Paramore and updating the comprehensive neighborhood plan, because it's 8+ years old at this point, and targeting some specific areas of Paramore that are feeling the most development pressure, and looking at what potential changes the city might be willing to support and what type of infrastructure is needed to support that. So that is something that David Barilla and I have been talking about, and we're looking into hiring a consultant to work on that project. So it does take a bit of time. A typical vision plan takes 6 months to a year to implement.
Now, I don't know if this is a Lori question or your question. Since the city does have quite a bit of land there in Paramore, and they're asking us to publish it every 3 years, they're not forcing us to sell to developers that might not be a great partner, are they?
No, that's just information about what's available. So the city still has all of its procedures for selling or leasing land that it would follow. So it doesn't have to go to anybody who picks up the phone and calls to ask. Mm-hmm.
The $100 million gap funding, which is great because there is some need in some of the projects that we wanted to move forward with, and as we know, material and all those things after COVID has increased, and there's just enough CRA money or just enough housing money, so that's a plus. I guess the component that I might ask is the multifamily component, that it was going to be a mixed-use component, Lori, there on Tampa and what is it, Gore? Well, this might be, right now it's been shelved. I know we approved it. Is this a possibility, Mayor, that maybe some of these funds could go forward with revamping that initiative? Right now we have the 30 townhomes that's being built, but there was a phase 2 that we were gonna do where it was gonna be retail below, and I think 1 and 2 bedrooms that was going to be upstairs. Do you remember that project?
With Hannibal Square,
Yeah.
off of Orange Center Boulevard. I don't know the specific answer to your question, but we can do some research on that and see if that would be eligible.
And I guess my last question is the administration review with no public hearing allowed. I heard you say it isn't required, but allowed is a definite. And oftentimes I do like to be transparent, and is it up to the city or?
No.
No, the state has said that we
right,
don't
the
have to
state
go to
says
the public.
we cannot send a project like that through a public hearing. And I think we could talk about, maybe providing some informational comments or, kind of an update, what's coming to your neighborhood, that kind of thing, but we couldn't do a formal public hearing.
Last question, I thought that was the last. How many miles away is our, let's say, starting there on Terry Street, South Street area, going back to Tampa, West Lakes area, is from downtown? It's more than a mile or less?
Yeah,
I know Paramore's
right.
less than a mile. But.
So if you look at the map, east of I-4, the 408 and Colonial are roughly a mile apart. So if you use that for scale, I do think you would hit West Lakes, at least part of it. But we can do some more analysis because OBT itself has some pretty high level zoning that allows fairly high heights as well. So even if it's more than a mile from downtown, it might be less than a mile from someplace that has a 200-foot height limit.
Thank you for your presentation. I know that we'll be talking more in depth about this project, so thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Commissioner Stewart?
Great, thank you, Mayor. I got a million questions, but let me just start with the opinion. The zoning exemptions are, in my case, offensive in every level. Okay, when you deal with the city and you love our city and you want our city to make decisions on a local basis, that concerns me. A couple of things that come to mind that you shared on. First of all, the public hearing process. Is there any part of the public hearing process or the lack of public hearing process that makes it go into public hearing? As an example, restrictions in parking, superior design, bonuses, any of that flips a switch and moves that into a public process, or is it entirely done administratively?
The only circumstance I can think of is if a multifamily project truly does not meet the rest of the zoning code, that, you know, they can't meet the setbacks or they're asking for 0 parking or something like that. There's a possibility they would need a planned development zoning district. But I think developers will be very motivated to meet those standards. Our code is pretty straightforward in that respect. So I think that's an incentive actually for them to meet all the standards
When
so
you,
that they
when you
don't
have
have
a
to do that.
PD document, does that supersede these requirements? Outside of that example, I'll pick on Baldwin Park as an example.
Right. So it would not. So Baldwin Park might have a height limit of 4 stories. If there's a site within a mile that has a height limit of 100 feet, you know, there's only so many lots left in Baldwin Park that aren't built yet, but if you could find one, then yes, you could do 200 units per acre and whatever the height limit is within a mile.
So this law supersedes existing plan development documents?
Yes.
Second question, affordable housing criteria and who monitors that? That's a concern of mine. If somebody who
Right.
walks in and says, I'm going to do 40%, gets all the approval, steps up, and the next thing you know, how do we know 10 years later he's actually doing it?
There's really not a lot about monitoring in the Live Local Act, which leads me to believe it's up to the local governments to enforce that. So that's, there's a legal document called a land use restriction agreement that can outline, here are the requirements for this property. It gets recorded, and if a property owner doesn't meet the standards, there's a process outlaid in that agreement of what would happen next if it's a code enforcement action or something like that, that they would have to go through if they don't meet it.
But that requires that we ask them to report back to us certain information and then we respond, or is that, I mean, do we have an entire process and procedure for that, or is it we have to develop that?
So we will have to develop that. We are a little bit ahead of the game in the sense that we do have some projects already on the books that if they get built will be locally monitored because they're not asking for tax credits, but they are providing affordability. So we're prepared to be able to do that with annual reports and kind of working through that. So this will just expand potentially the number of projects that we will review in that fashion.
You mentioned 3 criteria, and I think part of the problem is that the state generalization of the criteria doesn't match up to what we have. So you mentioned commercial, industrial, and then mentioned mixed use. As mixed use as being commercial, or, and I guess the question I'm asking is, R3 is primarily in apartment complexes. Wouldn't that also be considered commercial? And what about R2?
No. Our comp plan and our zoning code define residential zoning districts, residential uses, office uses, and commercial uses, and those are all separate. So my reading of mixed-use districts means it would include commercial and industrial or something else, maybe office, maybe government, that kind of thing. or residential. So our activity center districts are mixed use.
So does your map
districts.
include on it not only commercial, industrial, it's also include mixed use?
Well, our commercial zoning districts are mixed use. So
Okay.
for Orlando, yes,
Yeah.
it's one and the same. Other communities don't have that, and they have specific commercial zoning districts, and then they've done some special rules where they have mixed use and allow residential, but it's a different zoning district. Ours are one and the same.
And my brain goes to how we classify, so R1, R2, R3, O1, and MU. And so when I'm looking
Right.
at zoning on our map, am I looking at everything that's,
So we have
Oh,
not,
mine and
yeah,
MU.
we have not shown any of those zoning districts on this map because they don't allow commercial and they don't allow industrial.
okay. What's available inventory is an unusual request, especially unless it's just the idea of putting political pressure on us to take property that's not in use and convert it. But the question is, does it apply to all jurisdictions? Does it only apply to city or county? Does it apply to school boards?
It applies to all local government jurisdictions. I think we would have to look into the question about the school boards and do some research, because the act does talk about special districts, but I would have to get with an attorney to determine what that means and if the school board is included. But I can do some research on that.
Well, the reason I'm asking is with what's happened recently in Eatonville and the changes of that school board property getting ready to become commercial property. And the next question now is that declares affordable housing. Is that property required to be determined as available? Does that property get used that way? Is it override any agreements that you may have in the past of the use of the property? I can imagine there's a couple of school locations in the city that may be more valuable when times get tough, may be more valuable to convert to a 20 or 30 or 40 acre development at a very high density for the school.
Right, and I don't have the answer to that today, but I will look into that for you to see if the school board is covered.
Right. I apologize. I'm not frustrated at you. I'm frustrated at our state.
I understand.
It seems to be that, in my mind, it's kind of a carrot and the stick, and they provide a lot of carrot, and then they came back and provided a lot of preemption on the local level. And it seems to me that they're addressing issues for individual cities around the state at the cost of the rest of the state. So that's a concern of mine, and as long as I can scream it, I'll scream it. I trust our city. If we're not doing a good job, then vote us out. It's kind of a simple task. But I've already explained part of this to some of our neighborhood associations, and they are not very happy about it. And they now are understanding that they need to pay more attention to what's going on in the state legislature. So anyway, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Burns.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your presentation, and also, you and your team's analysis up to this point. And I share a lot of the concerns that my colleagues have already expressed, but also I think there may be some significant opportunities that we as a city may have to control what we can control, and this legislation doesn't give us a lot of leeway in that. But I do think that we need to, while we're talking about affordable housing, also talk about housing in general to relieve some of that downward pressure that, oftentimes pushes those who are at the lower income kind of out of the housing market. So looking forward to having those discussions. You mentioned that we still have a team that Cal and his team are still in Tallahassee advocating. Are there some specific things or amendments that they're advocating for this particular legislation that we may need to be aware of and could potentially advocate on the city's behalf ourselves?
So I would suggest you all take a look at House Bill 439. It has some amendments in it. I'm not familiar. I know that there's a lot of legislation that gets proposed and goes nowhere, so I don't know what the likelihood of that moving anywhere, but that would make some more changes on the definition of affordability and the time frame and that kind of thing. So that's the one to look out for, and I think you could probably check in with Kyle to ask him if it's moving ahead full steam or not going anywhere at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
So that conclude, Commissioner Ortiz, I'm sorry.
Mayor, I apologize. Elizabeth, I do have one more question,
Yep,
Mayor.
Commissioner Ortiz.
Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Ortiz. I apologize.
Ladies first.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
The vision plan, as you say, we're seeking a consultant, and it usually take about 6 months, and then you got to have some charrettes or whatever we're gonna do. If someone, this takes effect in July, is it?
That's correct.
So if someone come in within those 6 months to want to put a 25-story building there in the center of Paramore where we have residential homes, what's the options? We have none?
We have to make sure it's affordable according to the definition, and that's, a tax credit project is never going to be that tall because the tax credits just don't fund
But
a
it
project
doesn't,
that
this
big.
supersedes,
Right, so the question is there a market rate developer out there who wants to build a 25-story building so badly that they're willing to give
let's
up?
play devil advocate.
Yeah.
That they're not looking for today. And we know the progress that's happening in the renaissance of Paramore, maybe versus land banking. They're saying, hey, 5 years, this is gonna be so profitable. Let's not say 25 stories. I'll go as far as say 15 stories. That's a lot when I got all of those single family or 2 stories there in the mix of Paramore. But they can go up that high. I think our tallest right now, I'm not really concerned about the creative village component, but that core of Church Street, South Street, Westmoreland area, with all those little apartments and single-family homes with a 15-story complex.
Right.
We have nothing we can do until we reach this plan and the zoning and different things that we're gonna work with.
Right, and really after we do the vision plan, the state law is what it is, and we're going to have to work around that regardless. And I think what's unknown here is the overall impact to the land market. And, you know, we've already seen in some neighborhoods where land value gets higher and higher and higher, but nobody
Exactly.
wants to actually build the building that's based on that value. So that's, I think, a big concern for a lot of neighborhoods, is that people may tie up properties under contract and not actually.
I'm just so,
act on
for
it.
me, it's great about some of the possibilities, but when I look at the map, Mayor, it's District 5, it's all the great work that we've done to do great responsible work might become nullified, and as Commissioner Sheehan stated, it's great that it'll be affordable, but affordable for who? Right. And so that's my fear. Thank you.
Commissioner Ortiz.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to thank you for this presentation. There's any way that we can create something a little simpler to take to the community, because there's going to be a lot of confusion out there. And I know we're going to get all kinds of questions. And so if we are proactive in conveying this information to the community, I want to echo the words of Commissioner Sheehan in terms of that 120% AMI. But sadly enough, that's what happens when we have people in Tallahassee, and I'm not referring to our delegation because our delegation checked us, but we have people in Tallahassee that have never worked at the local level. So of course they keep speculating what's best for us, and they come up with this stuff without even consulting. Having said that, when somewhere one of these pages you was talking about the parking spaces close to major transit stops. When we talk about major transit stops, how we define that? Is it just a regular stop that is, it's commonly assisted by, frequent by people, or is it one of the major stops like the Colonial Mall or something like that?
So when we've done our local incentives, it has been for what we call premium transit, which is Sunrail and limo, because those run frequently or have high volumes, as opposed to, you know, a bus stop that has a bus every 2 hours isn't as convenient. So I think we would stick with our local definition unless we get more direction otherwise.
Well, thank you. That's all I had, and I really appreciate the presentation.
Commissioner Sheehan.
Yeah, I just had a quick follow-up. Sorry. Had a quick follow-up. The hurricane, this is where the state might not realize, and I hate to let the evil empire know what's going on because they're always preempting us on everything. But in height, where is that sweet spot where the hurricane standards kick in, and that might help us keep some of these heights down because it gets more expensive. Is it 6 stories, Elizabeth?
Well, 75 feet is
75
what's considered a high rise
Right.
in the building code, and that's where the fire requirements get more stringent and that kind of thing. I'm not sure how that relates to the hurricane standards. I think everything these days has a lot of hurricane requirements associated with it.
But a lot of
75
developers
feet.
say they want to keep under that 75 feet.
Yeah.
So that might actually be something that helps us to keep these heights down to where they're not ridiculous, because I share Commissioner Hill's concern. I don't have a situation where I've got too many right next to residential, but she does. But that 75 feet might be a barrier in terms of financing. And like I say, I hate to give the evil empire any ideas. They might come back and mess with that somehow, but that might actually help us somewhat with the height. So, and that was all I had, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you,
That
Mayor.
will conclude our workshop for today.